The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their cold, unrelenting glow spilling across the polished tiles of the police academy's main hall. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and the faint echo of authority place, where discipline wasn't just expected, it was etched into every corner, every sound. Boots clicked rhythmically against the floor, voices barked orders with practiced precision, and the walls themselves seemed to hum with the weight of rules and tradition. For most, this was a sanctuary of order, a fortress where hierarchies stood tall and unquestioned. But for Mia Lewis, stepping through those heavy glass doors felt like crossing into hostile territory, a battlefield, where the enemy wore a badge and hid behind a smirk. Maya's heart thudded in her chest as she adjusted the blazer. She'd spent far too long choosing that morning. It was dark gray, professional yet understated, the kind of outfit that whispered competence without shouting for attention. Her dark curls were pulled back into a tight bun, a choice she'd wrestled with in front of the mirror, polished enough to fit in, but maybe too severe, too exposed. Every detail of her appearance was a calculated shield, a way to deflect the judgment she knew was coming. She could feel it already, the weight of eyes trailing her as she moved past clusters of recruits and officers. Some glanced quickly and looked away, others lingered, their stares heavy with unspoken questions. Too young, too black, too ambitious. She'd heard it all before, not in words but in the silences, the tightened lips, the subtle shifts in posture. It followed her like a shadow from the classrooms where teachers doubted her, to the job interviews where smiles never reached the eyes, and now here, in a place she'd fought tooth and nail to belong. She wasn't a stranger to this world. Her father had worn the badge, a good cop, the kind who believed justice wasn't just a word but a promise. Growing up, Mia had sat at the kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa, listening to his stories. Some filled her with pretty tales of late-night rescues and quiet victories. Others simmered with angry accounts of corruption, of good men chewed up by a broken system. He'd taught her how to stand tall, how to choose her fights wisely, and when to dig in her heels and push back harder. When he died in the line of duty, a piece of her shattered, but it forged something else to avow. She wouldn't just carry on his legacy, she'd reshape it, carve out a space where the badge meant something better. 3 years of sweat, late nights, and sacrifices had brought her here. Yet every step forward seemed to meet a wall, and today, that wall had a name. Officer Daniel Reed lounged against the front desk, his crisp uniform stretched taut across broad shoulders. His belt bristled with gear handcuffs, radio, gunnel of it gleaming under the harsh lights. He carried himself with the easy arrogance of someone who'd never had to question his place, a man whose confidence had been handed to him on a silver platter and reinforced daily. His buzzed blonde hair caught the light, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the room like a predator sizing up prey. Mia noticed him the moment she walked in. At first, she dismissed it, just another pair of eyes, another fleeting judgment she'd learned to shrug off. But as she turned down the hallway toward the training rooms, his voice sliced through the air, sharp as a whip and twice as commanding. "Hey, stop right there. This is a restricted area, you can't be here." The words hit her like a gust of wind, halting her mid-step. She turned slowly, her pulse quickening, and faced him. His boots thudded heavily against the tile as he closed the distance, each step deliberate, a show of dominance. His hand rested casually on the holster at his hip, fingers brushing the grip of his gun, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. But Mia saw it for what it was, a threat. Her breath hitched, but she forced her shoulders back, refusing to shrink. His tone had been venomous, laced with a hostility that caught her off guard. She gripped the ID badge dangling from her neck, its plastic edges biting into her palm as she steadied herself. "I have authorization to be here," she said, her voice calm, measured, a tightrope walk between defiance and restraint. She lifted the badge slightly, letting it catch the light, her dark eyes locking onto his without a flicker of hesitation. Inside, her stomach twisted, a storm of nerves and indignation churning beneath her composed exterior. She'd prepared for this, knew the scrutiny would come, but the raw edge of his disdain still stung. Reed didn't even glance at the badge. His gaze raked over her instead, cold and dismissive, as if she were a smudge on his pristine world, something to be wiped away. "I don't care what you think you have," he snapped, his voice thick with condescension. Each word dripping like acid. You don't belong here. You need to leave. Now, the command landed heavy between them. A wall of contempt she could almost feel pressing against her chest. Her cheeks burned, heat rising fast, but she planted her feet firm against the tile. She wouldn't crumble, not here, not for him. I work here, she said, her voice still steady, though a faint tremor lurked beneath it, threatening to crack her resolve. I have every right to be here. The words were her anchor, a lifeline to the truth she clung to, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. Had she misjudged this place? Was all her effort just a fool's errand? Don't interrupt me, Reed barked, stepping closer. His presence loomed, a towering shadow that seemed to swallow the space around her. His breath was hot, his eyes glinting with something dark anger, maybe, or something uglier. Maya's throat tightened, her breath catching as she felt the room shift. Nearby, a handful of trainees and officers lingered, some in mid-conversation, others polishing gear. Their heads turned briefly, eyes darting toward the confrontation, then away just as fast. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was deafening, a collective refusal to see her, to acknowledge the injustice unfolding in their midst. She was alone, exposed, a single figure against a tide of indifference. You're resisting, is that it? Reed sneered, his voice low and menacing. A predator toying with its catch. The accusation hit her like a slap, disbelief surging through her. Resisting, she echoed, her voice cracking as the absurdity of it sank in. I haven't done anything wrong. I told Yao we have permission to be here. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists, hiding the shake. She wouldn't let him see her falter. His lips twisted into a smirk, a cruel, jagged thing that made her stomach lurch. You don't give me permission, he said, his tone slicing through the air, sharp and deliberate. I decide who stays and who goes, and right now, you're gone. The words were a gavel, a sentence handed down with relish. Her pulse roared in her ears, a frantic drumbeat drowning out the hum of the lights. She opened her mouth to argue, to claw back some shred of dignity, but before the words could form, his hand shot out. The grip on her arm was sudden, brutal, a vice of fingers digging into her flesh. She gasped, instinct kicking in as she tried to pull away, but his hold tightened, unyielding. Let go of me, she shouted, her voice raw and echoing off the sterile walls. A desperate cry that ricocheted through the hall. Humiliation crashed over her like a wave, hot and suffocating, as she stumbled under the force of his pull. The eyes she'd felt earlier were back, boring into her now, a silent audience to her degradation. Still, no one moved. Tears of rage stung her eyes, sharp and unwelcome, but she blinked them back fiercely. She wouldn't break it for him, not for them. You need to learn to follow orders, Reed snapped, yanking her closer. His strength was overwhelming, unnecessary, a display of power meant to crush her spirit. She could smell the faint tang of his aftershave, feel the heat of his breath as he leaned in. His voice a growl against her ear. You're out of line. You don't belong here. You never will. The words burrowed deep, each one a dagger aimed at her core. And then, as swiftly as it began, he released her with a shove. She staggered back, catching herself against the wall, her chest heaving as she fought to steady her breath. Reed turned away, his boots clicking dismissively as he strode off, leaving her there like discarded trash. To him, it was nothing, a fleeting annoyance, a power trip barely worth his time. But to Mia, it was everything, her fists clenched at her sides, nails biting into her palms as her heart thundered with a mix of fury and resolve. He didn't know who she was, none of them did. She wasn't just another face in the crowd, another woman to be dismissed. She was Mia Lewis, daughter of a hero, survivor of a system rigged against her, and now, a force he'd underestimated. As she stood there, the cold wall pressing against her back, a fire ignited in her chest. This wasn't over, not by a mile. Reed thought he'd won, thought he'd put her in her place. But he'd just lit a match under someone who'd spent her life learning how to burn brighter. The next time they faced each other in this hall, the ground would shift beneath his feet. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every voice silenced, every soul crushed by men like him. Justice wasn't just a badge she'd wear. It was a weapon she'd wield. And when that day came, when the tables turned, It wouldn't just be Reed who faced the consequence, it would be the whole rotten system. That propped him up, a structure built on arrogance and unchecked power. The lesson was clear: abuse authority, and it will come back to haunt you. Maya's hands steadied. Her breathing slowed, and a quiet, dangerous certainty settled over her. She'd reclaim her voice, her place, her power. And when Reed realized who he'd crossed when he saw his career, his smug little world, dangling in her hand, she'd learn what it meant to face the fire he'd sparked. This story wasn't ending here. It was only beginning. The air hung heavy with tension as Maya lifted her badge, the laminated surface catching the dim light overhead. "I have clearance to be here," she said, her tone steady, but laced with an undercurrent of exasperation she couldn't fully mask. Reed, standing just a few feet away, didn't even glance at the ID dangling from her hand. His eyes remained fixed on her face, unyielding, as if she were some puzzle he had no intention of solving. Instead of acknowledging her words, he took a slow, deliberate step closer, his fingers brushing the holster strapped to his hip. The gesture was casual, almost lazy, but it carried a weight that made her chest tighten. "That's so funny," he drawled, his voice thick with something that wasn't quite amusement. "I don't remember seeing you round here before." The words sliced into her, not because they caught her off guard. She'd been expecting some version of this, but because they echoed a tired, familiar refrain she'd heard too many times to count. Each syllable stung like a splinter working its way deeper under her skin, a reminder of every moment she'd been made to feel like she didn't belong. She drew a slow breath, forcing her voice to remain even. "I'm here for work," she said, her gaze locked on his. "If you've got questions, I suggest you take it up with your supervisor." That should have been the end of it. In a just world, it would have been. But Reed's smirk only widened, a crooked slash across his face that made her stomach churn. He crossed his arms, planting himself firmly in her path like a wall she'd have to climb over. "Work, huh? And what kind of work would that be?" Her fingers tightened around the badge until the edges bit into her palm. She knew this Gamia was baiting her, testing how far he could push before she snapped. She'd seen it before, felt the same suffocating pressure from men just like him. Men who wielded their authority like a blunt instrument. "I'm here on official business," she said, her voice clipped but controlled. Reed tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he took her in. "You don't look very official to me," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. Each word a deliberate jab meant to undermine her. It hit harder than she wanted to admit. She was no stranger to this kind of dismissal, but there was something in the way he said it cold, certain, like her presence was a personal affront to him that made her blood simmer. "Let me pass," she said, her voice rising slightly, firm and unyielding despite the storm brewing inside her. But Reed didn't move. Instead, he leaned in closer, close enough that she could smell the faint tang of coffee on his breath. His voice dropped to a low, menacing murmur, meant for her ears alone. "People like you don't get special treatment here, so I suggest you turn around before you make a fool of yourself." Her heart thudded against her ribs, a frantic rhythm she couldn't quiet. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced her resolve. She'd steeled herself for pushback, trained her mind to weather resistance. But this blatant hostility, this thinly veiled threat masquerading as protocol, was something else entirely. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, refusing to let him see the tremor in her hands. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her words a defiant anchor in the chaos of her thoughts. That was when everything unraveled. Reed's hand shot out, closing around her arm, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to send a clear message. He could do more if he chose to. The room around them seemed to freeze, the hum of fluorescent lights and distant voices fading into a suffocating silence. A handful of people nearby turned to look, their faces a gallery of reaction: curiosity, unease, indifference, but not one of them spoke. The weight of their silence pressed down on her, amplifying the heat rising in her chest. "Let go of me," she said, louder now, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief. Reed held her gaze, unflinching, his grip steady. "Not until you show me where you're supposed to be, sweetheart." The word landed like a slap, stripping away every shred of respect she'd fought to earn, reducing her to something small and insignificant in his eyes. With a sharp jerk, she wrenched her arm free, stepping back as adrenaline flooded her veins, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "You just made a big mistake," she said, her voice low and cutting. Reed Lafayette harsh, barking sound that twisted her stomach into knots. "Oh yeah, and what are you gonna do about it?" For a moment, Maya faltered. She'd run through scenarios like this in her head, braced herself for confrontation. But now, standing in the thick of it, the reality crashed over her like a wave. The humiliation burned, hot and bitter, mingling with a creeping sense of powerlessness she despised. Worse still was the realization that to him, she was nothing, just an annoyance he could shove aside without a second thought. But Reed didn't know her, none of them did. And that was his fatal misstep. This wasn't the end of her story, it was the spark that would ignite it. Because while Reed saw her as another woman he could bully into submission, Maya carried a truth he couldn't fathom. She wasn't just here to do a job. She was here to seize control, to dismantle the fragile power he clung to. The only question left was how far he'd tumble before he realized the ground beneath him had already begun to crumble. Later, Maya sat in her car, the steering wheel cold beneath her hands as she gripped it with white-knuckled intensity. The parking lot outside the police academy stretched out before her, nearly deserted now. The last few officers drifting away in clusters, their laughter floating through the evening air like nothing was wrong. But for her, the world was a jagged mess of sharp edges and unresolved fury. Her arms still prickled where Reed had grabbed her, the memory of his smug, self-satisfied grin seared into her mind. She could hear his voice replaying in her head, sharp, condescending, crafted to shrink her down to nothing, and for a fleeting moment, it had worked. She'd felt small, exposed, a trespasser in a space she'd fought to claim. But that moment had passed. She exhaled slowly, prying her fingers loose from the wheel, forcing the tension out of her body. This wasn't over. Reed might think he'd won, that he could dismiss her with a smirk and a shove. But he was wrong. He didn't know who she was, and that ignorance would be his undoing. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from the spiral of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Darren, her rock, the one person who'd stood by her through every fight, every bruise to her pride. She answered before it could ring twice. "What happened? You're still there, aren't you?" His voice crackled with worry, cutting through the fog in her mind. "I'm fine," she said, but the tightness in her throat betrayed her. "No, you're not. I can hear it. Talk to me." She hesitated, the words clawing at her chest, begging to be let out. Then they spilled, raw and unfiltered. Reed's hostility, the way he'd grabbed her, the way the others just watched, their silence a heavier blow than his words. "That bastard," Darren spat, his anger a mirror to her own. "He thinks he can get away with this." "He already has," she said, bitterness seeping into her voice. No one said a thing. No one stepped in. "It's like they're afraid of him, or they just don't give a damn." "They don't care," Darren said, his tone softening but resolute. "And that's exactly why you're Toretto. Change it. Don't let him get in your head." She nodded, though he couldn't see her, the motion grounding her. "I won't. But it's not just him, it's all of Itha's whole system. He's not the first to treat me like this, and he won't be the last unless something shifts." "Then make it shift," Darren urged. "Show them who you are. Show them what you're capable of." She hung up, steadier now but restless, a fire kindling in her core. Anger wasn't something she let fester, it was fuel, and she'd use it. Starting tomorrow. The next morning, Maya strode into the academy with her shoulders squared, her chin lifted high. The sting of yesterday still lingered, but she buried it deep, refusing to let Reed or anyone else see her rattled. She was here for a purpose, and she'd see it through. But Reed wasn't about to let her off easy. He was already there, lounging against the reception desk like he owned every inch of the building, his eyes snapping to her the moment she crossed the threshold. That smirk crept back across his face, slow and deliberate, twisting her in sides with a fresh wave of disgust. "Back so soon?" he called, loud enough to draw every pair of eyes in the room. "Didn't get enough attention yesterday." She didn't break her stride, brushing past him without a glance, but his voice chased her. "Hey, I'm talking to you." She stopped, turning slowly, her gaze locking onto his. "I'm here to work," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "If you can't handle that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong." Reed's expression darkened, his jaw tightening, but before he could fire back, another voice sliced through the air. "Everything okay here, Sergeant Evans?" A grizzled veteran with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air stepped into view, his gaze darting between them. Maya opened her mouth, but Reed jumped in first, his tone smooth as oil. "No problem, just making sure the new staff knows the rules." Her fists clenched at the word staff. Another attempt to diminish her, to paint her as an outsider beneath him. She forced herself to stay composed. "Everything's fine," she said, meeting Evans' eyes. He studied them both for a moment, then nodded and walked off, leaving them alone again. Reed stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You should be careful. You might think you've got this all figured out, but you don't. People here talk, and they don't like outsiders stirring up trouble." "Is that a threat?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. He smiled, but it was cold, hollow. "Just friendly advice." She held his stare, unflinching, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Thanks, but I don't need it." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his words echoing behind her. He was trying to shake her, to plant seeds of doubt, but she wouldn't let him. Not now, not ever. Over the next few days, the tension thickened, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Every encounter with Reed was a skirmish's taunts, her defiance, the unspoken understanding that this was bigger than either of them. He wielded his power like a weapon, but it was a flawed one, built on arrogance and fragile pride. And Maya, she was forging something stringergistus, hard-earned and unyielding. Reed's fall was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't just be a lesson for him. It would be a reckoning for everyone who'd stood by and let him wield his authority like a tyrant. The system might bend under men like him, but she'd make damn sure it wouldn't breaken it while she was still standing. The air in the precinct clung to Maya like a damp shroud, heavy with unspoken judgment. Wherever she went, Officer Reed seemed to materialize his presence, a constant, oppressive shadow. He didn't just watch her. He studied her, his eyes glinting with a predator's patience, waiting for the tiniest misstep to pounce. Maya felt it in her bones, the weight of his stare, the silent accusation that she didn't belong. Every glance from him was a brick added to the wall he'd built to keep her out, a wall the other officers seemed content to reinforce with their averted gazes and hushed conversations. She was the outsider here, and Reed reveled in making sure no one forgot it. But what gnawed at her wasn't just his hostility, it was the ignorance behind it. He had no idea who she truly was or why she'd come. That ignorance was a ticking bomb, and its detonation was closer than he could ever imagine. Reed didn't suspect a thing. To him, Maya was just another face, a temporary nuisance he could bully into submission or scare off entirely. He couldn't see the steel beneath her calm exterior, the purpose that fueled her every move. She wasn't here to play the observer or offer timid suggestions from the sideliness. Was here to take the reins, to reshape this rotting department from the inside out. And the moment that truth hit him, it would shatter the fragile kingdom he'd built on intimidation and unchecked arrogance. The reckoning began to take shape during a routine staff meeting, one of those endless gatherings where voices droned over training schedules and procedural updates. Maya sat in the back, her notebook open, her pen scratching quietly across the page. She kept her head down, absorbing every word, every tone, every shift in the room's restless energy. At the front, Reed held court, his broad shoulders squared, his voice booming with the kind of confidence that demanded attention. He leaned forward in his chair, dominating the discussion as if the meeting were his personal stage. "We need to tighten up recruitment standards," he declared, his tone sharp and self-assured. "Too many people are slipping through the cracks, people who don't belong here." The words hung in the air, barbed and deliberate. Maya's pen froze mid-stroke, the ink pooling into a tiny black dot on the paper. She lifted her gaze, slow and deliberate, until her eyes locked with Reed's across the crowded room. For a fleeting second, he held her stare, his lips curling into a smug, dismissive smirk before he turned away. That smirk, it was gasoline on the fire simmering inside her. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a wild, furious rhythm that drowned out the chatter around her. She pushed her chair back, the harsh scrape of metal against tile slicing through the room's hum. Every head turned, every pair of eyes fixed on her as the space fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. I have a few thoughts on that, she said, her voice steady, but laced with an edge that cut deeper than she intended. Reed swiveled slowly in his seat, that infuriating smirk faltering just enough to betray a flicker of unease. The air thickened, crackling with tension as Maya stepped forward. This was a spark that would ignite everything. The conference room felt like a pressure cooker, the atmosphere dense and oppressive. The long, polished table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting the rigid faces of the officers seated around it. Their uniforms were pristine, badges glinting like silent vows, but their expressions were masks and blank, some twitching with nervous curiosity. At the head of the table, Sergeant Evans sat like a stone sentinel, arms crossed, his stern gaze flickering between Maya and Reed. He hadn't said a word, but his silence carried weight, a tacit approval of whatever was about to unfold. Maya stood near the whiteboard, her hands gripping the podium's edge enough for support, but to anchor herself against the storm raging within. Her chest tightened with every breath, a mix of fury and resolve churning beneath her composed facade. Reed lounged in his chair, legs stretched out, his posture screaming nonchalance. But his iced host sharp, calculating, eye-tracked her every move, sizing her up like a hunter assessing a cornered animal. Since the meeting began, he'd worn that smug grin like a shield, as if he'd already scripted the outcome in his favor. Maya inhaled deeply, the sound of her own breath grounding her as she stepped into the center of the room. I called this meeting today to address something critical in this department, she began, her voice ringing out with a clarity that silenced the last whispers. She let her gaze sweep across the faces before her, meeting every pair of eyes that dared to look up. Accountability, integrity, respect. These are the pillars we're supposed to uphold. But lately, it's become painfully clear that we've drifted far from those ideals. Reed's smirk widened, a silent taunt. He leaned toward the officer beside him, a weary man named Jenkins, whose pinched face betrayed a nervous loyalty, and muttered something under his breath. Jenkins stifled a laugh, his shoulders shaking slightly. Maya didn't flinch, didn't even blink. This isn't just about rules or paperwork, she continued, her tone hardening. It's about the culture we've let fester, a culture that turns a blind eye to intimidation, to discrimination, to the blatant abuse of power. Her eyes locked onto Reed's, unwavering. A culture that stops today. Reed arched an eyebrow, folding his arms with exaggerated calm. Sounds like a lot of fancy talk. He shot back, his voice slicing through the room like a thrown knife. But I'm still not sure why we're wasting time on this. Some of us have actual work to do. The words dripped with mockery, a challenge meant to rattle her. Maya didn't hesitate. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor with a precision that echoed like gunfire in the tense silence. You think this is a waste of time? She asked, her voice low but piercing. Let me clarify it for you. She reached into her folder, her movements deliberate, and pulled out a thick stack of papers. With a flick of her wrist, she dropped them onto the table in front of Reed, the thud reverberating through the room. He glanced down, his smirk fading as his eyes caught the bold, official letterhead, internal affairs, complaints, reports. This is your legacy with this department, Maya said, her words sharp enough to draw blood. 6 complaints of misconduct, for documented cases of excessive force. 2 formal reprimands. Reed's face tightened, the color draining from his cheeks as he shoved the papers aside with a rough swipe of his hand. Those were dismissed, he snapped, his voice brittle. No, Maya countered, stepping even closer, her shadow falling across him. They were buried. But not anymore. The room went deathly still. Reed's eyes darted to Sergeant Evan, searching for an ally, but Evan's face remained a blank slate. His lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. This is ridiculous, Reed growled, shoving his chair back and rising to his feet, his bulk towering over the table. You think you can just waltz in here and sit down? Maya cut in, her voice cracking through the air like a whip. For the first time, Reed faltered, his bravado flickering. Sit down, she repeated, slower, colder, and this time, he obeyed, sinking back into his seat with a scowl. You want to talk about power, Officer Reed? Maya pressed, closing the distance until she stood mere feet from him. Let's talk about how you've wielded your stow bully to belittle, To make people feel like they're nothing. You thought you were untouchable, that no one would dare call you out. But that ends now. Reed's jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. You don't get to decide that. He spat. Yes, I do, Maya replied, her voice steady as granite. She turned to Evan, handing him another folder. He opened it, his eyes scanning the pages before lifting to meet hers with a glimmer of something respect, maybe, or reluctant admiration. Maya faced the room again, her stance unyielding. As of this morning, I'm not just a visitor here. I've been appointed the new chief of police for this department. Her words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the stunned silence. The reaction was immediate. Whispers erupted, officers exchanging wide-eyed looks or shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Jenkins, the weary one next to Reed, froze, his earlier amusement replaced by a sickly pallor. Another officer, a young woman named Carter, with sharp features and a quiet intensity, sat up straighter, her lips parting in surprise before curling into a faint, approving nod. Reed, though, went white, the blood draining from his face as the reality crashed over him. You're lying, he rasped, but the bravado was gone, his voice a hollow shell. Maya stepped closer, her eyes boring into his. No, I'm not, and you know what that means, don't you? He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, but no words came. It means your days of hiding behind that badge, of terrorizing people because you think you're above the law are finished. From now on, you answer to me. Reed surged to his feet again, his chair screeching against the floor. You think you can do this? You think you can just stroll in and ruin my career? His voice trembled with rage, but beneath it lurked something rougher, maybe, or the dawning realization of his own fragility. Maya didn't budge. You ruined your own career, she said, her tone as cold and unyielding as steel. I'm just ensuring you face the consequences. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Officers avoided Reed's gaze, their discomfort palpable. Carter's eyes flicked between them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Jenkins stared at the table, his earlier snicker long forgotten. For the first time, Reed looked lost, the unshakable confidence he'd worn like armor crumbling beneath the weight of his own choices. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low and venomous, a desperate grasp at control. Oh, it's far from over, Maya replied, her calm unshaken. But the next moves aren't yours to make, they're mine. Reed's fists balled at his sides, knuckles whitening, but he didn't speak, didn't move. He stood there, a man unmoored, trapped by the consequences he'd never seen coming. Maya turned to the room, her gaze lingering on each face. Carter's quiet resolve, Jenkins' nervous avoidance, Evan's stoic neutrality. This department is about to change, she said, her voice carrying a promise and a warning. If you're not ready for that, the door's open. But if you stay, you'll be held to the highest standards. Becca's, that's what this community deserves. She strode toward the door, her footsteps steady, each one a declaration of intent. But just before she crossed the threshold, she paused, turning back to Reed. Pack up your things, she said, her tone final. You're suspended, effective immediately. And trust me, you're lucky that's all you're walking away with right now. Then she was gone, the door swinging shut behind her. Reed stood frozen, the world he'd built collapsing around him, the walls of his arrogance reduced to rubble. Outside, the hallway stretched endlessly before Maya, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Her heels clicked against the polished tile, a sharp, rhythmic sound that echoed through the empty corridor. But inside, her pulse roared, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she'd just done. Justice wasn't just a word here, it was a lesson, carved into the ruins of Reed's reign. And as she walked away, she knew this was only the beginning. A warning to anyone who thought power was theirs to abuse. The rush of adrenaline surged through her like wildfire, betraying the calm facade she fought to maintain. She had done it, stepped boldly into that stifling room, faced Reed with unwavering resolve, and dismantled the fragile empire of authority he'd spent years crafting around himself. Her heart pounded relentlessly against her ribcage, a thunderous rhythm echoing her triumph and dread in equal measure. Yet, as she stood there, the air felt thick, oppressive, clinging to her like a damp cloak she couldn't shake off. The weight of what had just transpired wrapped around her, a second skin she couldn't peel away. Heavy with the realization that this victory was only the first tremor of a much larger quake, her boots clicked softly against the polished floor as she moved toward the far end of the hall. Her steps deliberate but unsteady. She paused near the towering windows, her trembling fingers brushing against the cool glass as she sought something anything anchor. Herself. Beyond the panes, the parking lot sprawled endlessly under the golden glow of the afternoon sun. Rows of cars gleamed in orderly silence, their stillness a stark contrast to the chaos that had just erupted within these walls. The world outside seemed untouched, serene, blissfully ignorant of the storm that had raged moments ago. But Maya knew better. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't the end. The real tempest was still brewing, gathering strength in the shadows. From around the corner, Evans emerged, his presence quieter than usual, his steps measured as though he were testing the ground beneath him. The tension in his broad shoulders was palpable, a new rigidity that hadn't been there before the confrontation. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, and his physique with lines of experience was a mask of neutrality as he approached her. He stopped a few feet away, his hazel eyes catching the light as he studied her. "That was quite a scene back there," he said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much but still held hope. Maya straightened, forcing her voice to steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside her. Anger, pride, fear, all tangled into a knot she couldn't unravel. "It needed to happen," she replied, meeting his gaze head-on. Evans tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes softening at the edges, though they remained piercing, searching her for cracks. "You realize what you just did, don't you?" His tone wasn't accusatory, but there was an undercurrent of concern, a warning woven into his words. She turned to face him fully, squaring her shoulders as if bracing for a blow. "I made it clear this department won't keep tolerating what it has for years." Her words were firm, a declaration carved from years of silent resolve. Evans nodded slowly, but his expression darkened, shadows creeping across his weathered features. "You also cornered a man like Reed," he said, his voice dropping lower. "And men like him, they don't just fade away quietly. You'd better be ready for what comes next." Maya's jaw tightened, her teeth grinding together as she absorbed his words. She didn't flinch, didn't let the flicker of doubt in her chest show. "I've been ready for this fight my whole life," she said, her voice steady as steel, though beneath it, her pulse raced with the enormity of what lay ahead. Evans exhaled sharply through his nose, his eyes softening further, a trace of reluctant admiration breaking through his guarded demeanor. "I don't doubt that," he murmured, "but don't mistake his silence in there for surrender. Reed's the type who bides his time, waits for the perfect moment to hit back, and when he does, it'll be loud." Her gaze didn't waver, locked onto his as she processed the gravity of his warning. "I'll handle it," she said simply, her tone resolute, though inside, a sliver of unease coiled tighter. Before Evans could respond, the conference room door flew open with a violent crash, the sound reverberating down the hall like a gunshot. Both of them turned sharply, instinctively tensing as Reed stormed out, his face a furious shade of red, his movements jagged and wild, like a man teetering on the edge of control. His heavy boots pounded the floor, each step a deliberate declaration of his lingering fury, until he halted mere inches from Maya. The silence between them crackled, thick and suffocating, a storm cloud ready to burst. Reed's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his chest heaving as his dark eyes bored into hers with unrestrained venom. Then his voice sliced through the tension, low and sharp as a blade. "You think this is over?" he hissed, his lips barely moving, his words dripping with menace. Maya didn't budge, didn't blink, her body rooted to the spot as she stared him down. "It's over for you," she replied, her voice calm but unyielding, a quiet strength radiating from her core. Reed's lip curled into a sneer, and he leaned closer, his towering frame looming over her, his presence a wall of barely contained rage. Evans shifted subtly beside her, his muscles tensing as if ready to step in, but Maya raised a hand, a small but firm gesture that stopped him cold. "You have no idea what you've just started," Reed growled, his voice trembling with fury. his eyes wild with the desperation of a man watching his world crumble. "You think you can waltz in here, humiliate me in front of everyone, and just walk away like it's nothing?" Maya's eyes remained locked on his, unflinching, her voice rising just enough to cut through the haze of his anger. "No one humiliated you, Reed. You did that all on your own. And the fact that you still can't see it, that's exactly why you're standing here right now, stripped of everything you thought you controlled." His fists clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening as his entire body vibrated with rage, but she pressed on undeterred. "You've spent years hiding behind that badge, using it as a weapon to intimidate, to crush anyone who dared stand in your way, to convince yourself you're untouchable. But here's the truth, Reed, you are not untouchable, not anymore." His jaw locked, and for the first time, Maya caught a flicker in his eyes, something fleeting, uncertain, a crack in the armor he'd worn so arrogantly for years. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a renewed surge of defiance. "You think you're going to come in here and change everything overnight?" he snapped, his voice rising, desperation seeping into his tone as he fought to reclaim his footing. Maya stepped closer, closing the gap between them, her eyes blazing with conviction. "No," she said, her voice steady and piercing. "I think it's going to take time, hard work, and people who actually give a damn about what this badge is supposed to mean. But I'm not going anywhere, Reed, and neither is this fight." He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath hot against her skin as his voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "You don't belong here." The words hit her like a punch, stealing her breath for a fleeting moment, but she refused to let him see her falter. "Neither do you," she shot back, her voice a quiet thunder that echoed with finality. Reed's face darkened, his entire frame tensing as if he might lash out, but Evans stepped forward, his presence a steady wall of calm amidst the chaos. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and firm, placing a hand on Reed's shoulder with an authority that brooked no argument. Reed jerked away from the touch, his eyes still burning into Maya's, but the fight seemed to drain from him, if only for a moment. "This isn't over," he said, his voice quieter now but laced with a venom that promised retribution. Maya tilted her head slightly, a faint challenge in her gaze. "No, it's not," she replied. "But you are." For a heartbeat, Reed stood frozen, his chest rising and falling rapidly as the weight of her words sank in. Then, without another sound, he turned and stormed down the hall, his footsteps a fading drumbeat of fury, leaving an emptiness in his wake that felt both victorious and ominous. Maya exhaled slowly, her shoulders loosening as the tension ebbed from her body. Though the tightness in her chest refused to relent, she knew this wasn't the end. Reed wasn't the kind of man to slink away defeated. His parting words lingered like a dark promise, a shadow cast over the fragile hope she clung to. But fear didn't grip her as it once might have. She turned to Evans, catching the faintest glimmer of approval in his steady gaze. "You handled that well," he said, his voice softer now, carrying a warmth that surprised her. She nodded, her eyes drifting to the empty hallway where Reed had disappeared. "We're just getting started," she said, her tone resolute yet heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. As she turned and walked toward her office, the badge in her pocket pressed against her thigh, its metal cold and unyielding. It felt heavier than ever, a tangible reminder of the burden she'd chosen to carry. But she welcomed it, embraced it, because this fight wasn't over, it was only the beginning. The echo of Reed's retreating steps had long since faded, but the stain of his words clung to the air, a bitter aftertaste she couldn't shake. Maya sank into the leather chair behind her desk, the soft creak of the worn material grounding her as she leaned back. Her eyes fell to the neat stack of files before her, each one a testament to the rot she'd vowed to uproot. Complaints, investigations, whispered stories of officers who'd let power twist their purpose into something dark and unrecognizable. Some names stirred faint memories murmured in hushed tones down dimly lit corridors, dismissed as rumors or misunderstandings. Others, like Reed, were bolder, their transgressions shielded by a warped sense of loyalty and tradition that had festered too long. The desk lamp cast a warm, dim glow across the papers, illuminating the edges of statements and reports as Maya flipped through them. Her fingers trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the flood of memories they unleashed. She saw her father's funeral against crisp fold of the flag pressed into her hands, the hollow condolences offered by men who'd turned a blind eye when it mattered most. The system he'd believed in, served with unwavering faith, had failed him, and that betrayal had unraveled her world thread by thread. Now, sitting in this office where so many of those choices had been made, the weight of it all pressed down on her, heavier than the badge itself. A sharp knock at the door jolted her from her reverie. Evans stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the dim light spilling from the hall. He hesitated, his hand lingering on the knob before he closed the door with a soft click. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest out there," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying the quiet strength she'd come to rely on. Maya set the folder down, meeting his gaze across the cluttered desk. "I know," she replied, her tone even, though her jaw tightened as she braced for what he'd say next. He moved closer, dropping a thin report onto the desk with a muted thud. "Reed's already making calls," he said, leaning against the edge of the desk, his arms crossed. "He's trying to rally support, spinning a story that paints you as some outsider who doesn't get how things work around here." Maya exhaled slowly, her fingers curling into fists as a spark of anger flared in her chest. "And the others, what do they think?" she asked, her voice sharp with curiosity and defiance. Evans shrugged, his broad shoulders lifting slightly, a gesture that betrayed both weariness and resolve. "Some are shaken up, not sure what to make of you yet. They're caught between fear and hope. Fear of Reed, hope that you might actually pull this off. A few, though, they've been waiting for someone like you to come in and shake things up. The real question is whether they'll step up when it counts or keep their heads down, like they always have." His words hung between them, a quiet challenge wrapped in observation. Maya nodded, her mind racing as she pieced together the shifting loyalties around her. She'd expected pushback. Reed's influence ran deep, a tangled web of favors and fear, but hearing that he was already mobilizing against her so soon stoked a fire in her veins. This wasn't just about her anymore. If she faltered, it wouldn't only be her name dragged through the mute, it would send a message that justice was a fleeting dream, that men like Reed could twist the rules and walk away unscathed. She leaned forward, her hands resting on the desk, her eyes fierce with determination. "He can rally all he wants," she said, her voice low and resolute. "But this isn't his department anymore. It's ours." Evans studied her for a moment, a flicker of something pride, perhaps crossing his face before he nodded. "You're right about that," he said quietly. "But Reed's not going to let go without a hell of a fight, and neither should you." He pushed off the desk, stepping back toward the door, but paused with his hand on the knob. "You've got people watching you now, Myasome, who want you to fail, others who need you to succeed. Don't let them down." With that, he slipped out, leaving her alone with the files and the weight of a battle that was only just beginning. She stared at the closed door, her chest tight with the enormity of it all. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire forged through struggle. A lesson Reed and those like him would learn the hard way. The consequences of unchecked power had festered here too long, poisoning everything it touched. But Maya wasn't here to patch wounds, she was here to cut out the rot, no matter how deep it ran. The fight ahead would be brutal, unrelenting, but as she picked up the next file, her resolve hardened. This was her stand, her legacy, and she'd see it through, whatever the cost. The air in the dimly lit office felt thick as Maya sat alone, her fingers tracing the edges of the files sprawled across her desk. The silence pressed against her ears, broken only by the faint creak of her chair as she shifted her weight. Earlier that day, Evans had stood there, arms crossed tightly against his chest, his weathered face etched with caution. "Look, I get it," he'd said, his voice low but firm. "You're itching to hit hard, and you've got every right to. But you've got to play this smart. Reed's not dangerous because he's some mastermind, is dangerous because he's got nothing left to lose. And men like that, they don't fight fair." His words lingered in her mind like smoke, curling around her thoughts as she replayed them. Maya's dark eyes had narrowed at him, a spark of defiance igniting within her. "I'm not playing fair either," she'd shot back, her tone sharp, almost daring him to challenge her. Evans had given her the faintest hint of a smile, barely a twitch, at the corner of his mouth before nodding. "Good. Just don't drop your guard. He's not finished yet." Now, with Evans gone, Maya sat motionless, the quiet wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. The badge pinned to her chest seemed to pulse with a weight she hadn't noticed that morning, a tangible reminder of the battles she'd fought to get here. She didn't shy away from it. If anything, she leaned into it, letting it anchor her. Years of clawing her way up, years of shouting into a void that refused to echo back had hardened her resolve. Giving up wasn't an option, not now, not ever. But as her gaze drifted to the papers before her, a shadow of doubt crept in, subtle yet insistent. What if taking down Reed wasn't the end of it? What if he was just a symptom, a festering sore on a body far sicker than she'd realized? And if the whole system was rotten, if it had shielded him all this time, how much of herself would she have to sacrifice to rip it apart? The question gnawed at her, tugging at the frayed edges of her determination. The next morning, she arrived before the sun had fully risen, her boots echoing softly down the empty corridor. The precinct was still asleep, its usual hum of voices and ringing phones replaced by an eerie stillness. She liked it this way, quite enough to think, to plan. She pushed open the door to the briefing room and settled in front of the monitor. Her movements deliberate. Answers didn't come to those who waited, and she'd never been one to sit idle. With a few quick clicks, she pulled up the surveillance footage from the hallway incident with Reed. Her stomach twisted as the grainy video flickered to life, capturing the moment he'd seized her arm. His face filled the screen, arrogant, flushed with rage, his entitlement radiating through every tense muscle. She rewound it, then played it again, each frame searing itself into her memory. The way his fingers had dug into her skin, the sneer curling his lips. It wasn't just an attack, it was a declaration. He thought he owned this place, owned her. She watched it a third time, her jaw tightening until it ached, her breath shallow but steady. She was so lost in the footage that she didn't hear the door swing open. It wasn't until Evans stepped into her line of sight, his broad frame casting a shadow across the desk, that she jolted back to the present. His face was taut, his lips pressed into a thin line. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice clipped. Maya's pulse quickened, a jolt of adrenaline sharpening her senses. "What now?" she asked, leaning forward. Evans dropped a folder onto the table with a dull thud. "Reed's filed a complaint. Claims you're harassing him. Says you've got a personal vendetta and abused your authority to go after him." Her stomach plummeted, a cold wave washing over her, but she kept her expression steady, refusing to let the dread show. "He's twisting it," she said, her voice low and controlled. "Trying to make himself the victim." Evans nodded grimly. "And it might stick. Some of the old-timers are already buying it, saying you're too aggressive, stirring up trouble too fast." Maya rose to her feet, her hands gripping the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. "I'm not letting him spin this, not after what he's done." Evans hesitated, his eyes flickering with something unspoken. "There's more. He's threatening to release footage of your confrontation. Says it'll prove you crossed the line." Her breath hitched, a flash of panic slicing through her composure. "And you think he's got something?" she asked, searching his face. "No," Evans replied swiftly, shaking his head. "I don't, but others might." Maya began to pace, her boots thudding against the worn linoleum as her mind raced. She'd known Reed would fight back as kind always did, but this speed, this cunning, caught her off guard. She'd underestimated him, assumed his desperation would make him sloppy, not strategic. She stopped abruptly and turned to Evans, her voice cutting through the tension. "Get me a list of everyone he's talked to. I need to know who's in his corner and what's driving them." Evans shifted his weight, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. "You sure about this?" he asked. She met his eyes, unflinching. "I'm sure. Reed's not winning this, not now." As the door clicked shut behind him, Maya stood alone again, the silence heavier than before. She felt like she was teetering on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a chasm she hadn't fully grasped until this moment. Reed was a threat, yes, but he was a piece of something larger, a web of corruption and cowardice that stretched far beyond him. The line between justice and vengeance blurred in her mind, and with it came a question she'd dodged since the day she'd taken this job. How far would she go to see this through? And when it was over, when the smoke cleared and the wreckage settled, would she still recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror? Later that day, she stood by her office window, the faint hum of the city drifting up from the streets below. The skyline stretched out before her, a jagged silhouette against the gray March sky. But she barely registered it. The weight of the past few days bore down on her, pressing against her ribs like a vice. She refused to let it break her, refused to let it win. In the glass, her reflection stared back, calm, collected, a mask she'd perfected over years of battling invisible walls. Beneath it, though, frustration simmered, threatening to spill over into something hotter, something she couldn't control. She'd fought tooth and nail to carve out this space, to prove she belonged, and yet Reed's shadow still loomed, tainting everything she'd built. A sharp knock shattered her reverie, and Evans stepped inside without waiting for her to call him in. His movements were brisk, almost restless, his eyes darting around the room as if checking for unseen threats. He shut the door with a quiet click and approached her desk, a thick, battered folder clutched in his hand. Maya's chest tightened. She knew that look, knew it meant trouble. He set the folder down and leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Reed's been busy. He's got officers talking, spinning his story about you overstepping. There's even chatter about pushing for a formal review of your position. Some of them think you're a loose cannon here to destroy, not repair." Her jaw clenched as she flipped open the folder, her eyes scanning the list of names and statements. She recognized too many, men who'd greeted her with warm smiles, clapped her on the shoulder during briefings, nodded along when she'd preached accountability. Now, their words twisted her into a villain, a reckless upstart threatening their sacred order. Betrayal stung deep, but she swallowed it, focusing on the cold, hard facts. "This doesn't shock me," she said, her tone flat. "Reed's playing the martyr, and they're eating it up because it's easier than facing reality." Evans sighed, easing back slightly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of it all. "It's not just that they believe him. They're scared. You came in like a storm, took down one of their own, and now they're wondering who's next. Even the ones who support you are lying low. They don't want his crosshairs on them." Maya snapped the folder shut, her fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the desk. Anger flared in her chest, hot and fierce, but she wrestled it down. Rage wouldn't win. This needed precision, speed, control. Reed had the upper hand for now, and she couldn't afford to stumble. "So what's our move?" she asked, her voice edged with steel. Evans hesitated, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt in him, not just for her, but for himself. He wasn't blind to the stakes, to what backing her might cost if this went south. "We've got to get ahead of him," he said at last. "Show them you're not here to torch the place, you were here to fix it. But you need people on your side, and right now, you're short on friends." Maya exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting back to the window. Her reflection stared back, but the fire she'd felt earlier had dimmed, replaced by a creeping exhaustion. She pushed it away. She couldn't falter, not yet. "I'll talk to them," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll make them see why this matters." Evans shook his head, his expression hardening. "Words won't cut it. You need something concrete, something they can't look away from, something that forces the truth down their throats." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion coiling in her gut. What are you getting at?" she asked. He stepped closer, his voice dropping even lower. "Reed's sloppy. He's desperate, and desperate men slip up. We dig deeper than something undeniable, something that makes it impossible for anyone to stand by him." Her stomach churned at the suggestion. She wanted Reed gone, wanted to dismantle the rotten empire he represented. But the thought of sinking to his level, off playing his gamma, made her skin crawl. "And if we don't," she pressed, her voice tight. Evans met her gaze, unflinching. "Then he wins, and everything you've bled for collapses." She turned away, her mind spinning like a storm. She hated that he was right, hated the corner he'd backed her into. This wasn't just about Reed anymore. It was about the precedent, the message it would send if he slithered free. If men like him could always claw their way out, what did that say about justice? About her? "Do it," she said finally, the words scraping her throat as they left her. "Find something." Evans nodded, turning to leave, but she stopped him before he reached the door. "Make it clean," she called after him, her voice firm. "No shortcuts, no lies. If we're doing this, we do it right." He paused, then gave a curt nod before slipping out into the hall. Maya sank into her chair. her eyes drifting shut as the weight of her choice settled over her like a shroud. She could feel the threads of her morality stretching, straining under the pressure, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if they'd snap. Reed's fall would be a victory, but at what cost? Justice demanded sacrifice, but it also demanded truth, and the deeper she waded into this fight, the more she feared the two might not coexist. The lesson was bitter and unrelenting. Power, when abused, left scars on everyone it touched, and the pursuit of justice could just as easily twist the hunter into something unrecognizable. As the city hummed beyond her window, Maya steeled herself for the battle ahead, knowing that every step forward carried her closer to an edge she might not return from. The air in Maya's office hung heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and the faint hum of a flickering fluorescent light overhead. She sat motionless behind her desk, her fingers hovering over the edges of a photograph that stared back at her like a ghost from a life she'd fought to leave behind. Her entire existence had been a relentless climb, a testament to her belief that grit and honesty could outshine the grime of corruption. She'd clawed her way up, step by painstaking step, refusing to dip her hands into the muck of dirty games, even when the whispers in the precinct halls mocked her for it. But now, with everything she'd built teetering on the edge of collapse, the line between right and wrong blurred like ink bleeding across a soaked page. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with a gnawing uncertainty that made her question every choice she'd ever made. Hours slipped by unnoticed, the world outside her window fading from a muted gray to a deep, bruised purple as the sun sank below the horizon. The door creaked open, and Evans stepped in. No knock, no preamble, just the heavy thud of his boots against the worn hardwood floor. His face was a mask of stone, carved with lines of exhaustion and resolve, but his eyes carried a weight that mirrored her own. Without a word, he let a thick manila folder fall onto her desk, the sound sharp against the silence. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his voice low, gravelly, like he'd been chewing on the words for hours before spitting them out. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she peeled back the cover, her breath catching in her throat as the contents spilled into view. Photographs glared up at Reed's smug face, captured mid-laugh outside a dimly lit bar, his arms slung carelessly round a man she recognized from a cold case file that had vanished into the ether years ago. Emails followed, their curt sentences dripping with coded threats and promises. Reports detailed off-the-books deals, payoffs buried beneath layers of bureaucratic sludge, and whispers of cases that had been snuffed out before they could breathe. It was a tapestry of corruption, woven with threads far darker than she'd ever imagined. Her stomach churned, bile rising in her throat, but the vindication she'd craved didn't come. Instead, disgust settled over her like a damp fog, thick and suffocating. "This is enough," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile resolve holding her together. Evans nodded, his jaw tight. "It's more than enough. But now it's on you. What are you going to do with it?" His words landed like a challenge, heavy with the unspoken truth that this wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about her soul, her fight, her definition of justice. Maya's fingers curled around the edges of the pages, her knuckles whitening as her mind spun in a frantic dance of possibilities. She could fling this filth into the public eye, let the world see Reed for the monster he was, watch his empire crumble under the weight of his own sins. But the fallout wouldn't stop with him. It would ripple outward, dragging the entire department into a storm of scrutiny, tearing open scars that had barely begun to heal. Or she could hand it to internal affairs, let them sweep it under the rug with a quiet reprimand, risking that Reed would slither away unscathed, his smirk intact. Neither path felt clean, neither felt right. She looked up at Evans, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "We've finished this. No deals, no second chances." His expression darkened, a flicker of something pride, maybe, or dread crossing his face before he nodded. She sank back into her chair, the leather creaking under her weight, the burden in her chest growing heavier with every breath. She'd made her choice, but it was only the first step in a war that stretched out before her like a shadowed road. As she braced herself for the fight ahead, a quiet dread gnawed at her. Win or lose, there was no going back to the woman she'd been before this moment. The office felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the desk lamp cast jagged shadows across the room. The folder lay splayed open, its contents a chaotic mosaic of betrayal and greed. Maya traced the edge of a photograph again, her fingertip lingering on Reed's grainy image. She could almost hear his laugh, sharp, hollow, the kind that grated against her nerves. The timestamp on the photo burned into her mind, tying him to a night she'd spent poring over a case that had slipped through her fingers like sand. Receipts followed, crumpled and coffee-stained, each one a breadcrumb leading deeper into his web. The email trails were worseters, coded exchanges that made her skin crawl with their casual cruelty. A sharp knock jolted her from her thoughts, and before she could answer, Evans was back, shutting the door with a soft click that felt final. "We have to move fast," he said, his voice urgent but steady. The kind of calm that comes from years of staring down chaos. Reed knows we're onto him. "I saw him an hour ago, storming out of the precinct with a box of files. He's shredding his tracks." Maya shoved the folder aside and stood, her pulse hammering in her ears. She'd braced herself for pushback, but this was different. This was a cornered beast baring its teeth. "How much does he know?" she asked, her voice tight. "Enough to know he's trapped," Evans replied, stepping closer. "And trapped animals don't go quietly." Her hands pressed against the desk, grounding her as the reality sank in. This wasn't just about her job anymore, it was about survival. About clawing her way out of a pit Reed had dug with his own hands. "We can't let him walk," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. Evans met her gaze, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You need to be careful, Maya. If we hit him too hard, too soon, he'll turn this around. He's already spinning his story. People might buy it if we don't play this right." She shook her head, her resolve hardening like steel. "I'm done playing it safe. That's what he's banking on, me fear, my doubt. He doesn't get that from me anymore." Evans studied her, his silence stretching long enough to feel like judgment, then nodded. "Then we do it tonight. But brace yourself, this won't be pretty." Her stomach twisted, but she forced a nod. "I'm ready." Less than an hour later, Reed's voice roared through the hallway, a storm of rage and defiance as he shoved through the precinct doors. He didn't knock, just flung her office door open, his eyes blazing with a fury that made the air crackle. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snarled, slamming the door shut behind him with a force that rattled the frame. "Digging through my life, twisting it to fit your little fairy tale, thinking you can erase me?" Maya didn't flinch. She stepped around the desk, closing the gap between them, her voice steady as stone. "I don't have to twist anything, Reed. Your truth is loud enough on its own." He fade a brittle, cutting sound that echoed off the walls. "The truth, you wouldn't recognize it if it slapped you. You're so obsessed with proving yourself, with waving your shiny badge around. You don't care who you drag down with you." Her jaw clenched, but she held his gaze. "Don't make this about me. You built this mess, Reed. You chose this path. And now you're scrambling because you can't face what's coming." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "You think you're better than me? That your little office and your precious rules make you untouchable? This department wasn't made for people like you. It chews you up and spits you out." Maya leaned in, her voice a quiet blade. "Watch me prove you wrong." For a heartbeat, the room was still, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then Reed's face twisted, and he leaned closer, his words sharp as a dagger. "You'll regret this." She didn't blink. "No, you will." He turned on his heel, storming out with footsteps that thundered through the floor, the door slamming shut behind him like a gunshot. Maya stood frozen, her breath steady but her heart pounding, knowing the real fight was only beginning. Evans slipped back into the room moments later, his face tight with worry. "What now?" she exhaled, her eyes still locked on the door. "Now we end it." The hours that followed blurred into a haze of phone calls, hushed meetings, and the frantic scribbling of final reports. The evidence was ironclad: photos, emails, witness, but Reed wouldn't go down without a fight. He'd built his career on fear, on bending people to his will, and those tools didn't rust easily. By the time his suspension notice was official, the precinct buzzed with murmurs. Officers watched her as she moved through the halcyon with curiosity, others with doubt, a few with a quiet respect she could feel but didn't acknowledge. She found Reed at his desk, shoving papers into a cardboard box, with jerky, furious movements. He didn't look up, but the tension in his shoulders screamed his awareness of her presence. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice rough with exhaustion and defiance. Maya stepped closer. "It is. You just can't see it yet." He finally met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw something beneath the anger wariness, a crack in the armor that made him look smaller, more human than she'd ever imagined. "You think you've won?" he asked, his tone bitter. She held his gaze, unflinching. "This isn't about winning. It's about accountability you never grasped." Reed's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He grabbed the box and shoved past her, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared down the hall. Maya lingered there, the weight of the fight settling over her like a shroud. She'd battled for this, bled for it, and now, with the dust beginning to settle, exhaustion seeped into her bones. But she couldn't rest, not yet. Reed might be gone, but the department still bore his scars, and the real work of rebuilding, of seeking justice beyond vengeance, was only just beginning. In that dimly lit office, with the afternoon sun slicing through the blinds, Maya stood alone. The shadows stretched long and thin across the floor, mirroring the battle lines she'd drawn. Justice wasn't a trophy to hoist, it was a weight to carry, a lesson carved into her soul. Reed's fall was a stark reminder. Power, when twisted and abused, crumbled under its own rot. And as she prepared for the days ahead, she vowed to wield her own authority not as a weapon, but as a shield for herself, for the department, for the truth she'd sworn to uphold. The office felt different now, transformed in a way that went beyond the physical space. The desk, once buried beneath towering stacks of files, reports, and scribbled notes, gleamed under the soft glow of the overhead light, its surface bare except for a single pen resting in the corner. That emptiness wasn't just a sign of tidiness, it was a testament to the war she'd waged. A quiet victory etched into the wood itself. The chair behind it, stiff and unwelcoming just weeks ago, had softened beneath her, molding to her frame as if it had finally accepted her presence. She belonged here now, not as an outsider clawing her way in, but as someone who'd earned her place. Yet, even with this triumph, a heavy ache lingered in her chest, pressing against her ribs like an uninvited guest. The echoes of Reed's venomous threats still hissed in her ears, and the memory of skeptical glances from officers who'd once dismissed her clung to the edges of her thoughts like shadows refusing to fade. She knew the fight wasn't truly finished. Real change didn't sweep in overnight, and trust wasn't something you could demand with a single win. A sharp buzz from her phone jolted her out of the spiral of her mind. She glanced down, her breath catching for a split second as Evan's name flashed across the screen. Her fingers hesitated over the device, then moved with purpose as she answered, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning beneath it. "What's the update?" she asked, her tone clipped but calm, betraying none of the exhaustion she felt. "It's done," Evans replied, his voice carrying a mix of relief and finality. Reed turned in his badge an hour ago, packed up his box of files, and walked out without so much as a grunt to anyone. "It's over, Maya," she exhaled, long and slow, feeling the tension coiled in her shoulders unravel just enough to let her lean back against the desk. The cool edge of the wood pressed into her palms, grounding her as the weight of his words sank in. "And the investigation," she pressed, needing every detail, every confirmation that this wasn't just a fleeting win. "They're moving forward with the charges," Evan said, a hint of satisfaction threading through his words. "Everything you dug up in those reports, it's more than enough. He's not coming back from this. Even his loyal dogs are slinking away. No one wants to sink with that ship." Maya nodded to herself, her eyes drifting to the window where the late afternoon sun painted streaks of gold across the glass. She'd done it. Reed was gone, and not just sidelined, not just reprimanded, but stripped bare, his career collapsing under the weight of his own arrogance. Once, he'd ruled this place with an iron fist, his power rooted in intimidation, his name whispered in fear rather than respect. Now, that empire was dust, but instead of relief, a deeper, heavier feeling settled over her responsibility. With Reed out of the picture, the spotlight would turn to her, unrelenting and unforgiving. Every move she made would be dissected, every promise she'd uttered held up like a contract she'd signed in blood. Evan's voice crackled through the phone again, softer this time, hesitant. "There's something else you should know." Reed didn't go quietly. "He's been making calls, trying to twist the narrative, even now. But it's falling flat. People are done with him, with the old guard. They're ready for something new." Her grip tightened around the phone, her knuckles whitening as a flicker of resolve sparked in her chest. "Then let's give them something new," she said, her voice low but firm, a vow as much to herself as to him. Later that evening, the precinct hummed with a restless energy. Officers milled about in clusters, their voices hushed, but their eyes sharp, tracking her every step as she approached the podium. The air was thick with tension, a mix of curiosity and wariness swirling around her like a fog. Maya didn't flinch. She squared her shoulders, her boots clicking against the tiled floor with deliberate precision, and stepped up to face them. Her gaze swept over the crowdsome faces tight with doubt, others softened by a cautious glimmer of hope. She took a breath, letting it steady her, then spoke, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "This department has been through hell these past few weeks," she began, her words ringing clear and strong. "We've been tested, not just our rules, not just our procedures, but who we are at our core. Today, we draw a line. Today, we choose to be better, to hold ourselves to a standard that doesn't bend, to protect this community with everything we've got, and to earn the trust that comes with wearing this badge." She paused, letting the silence stretch, giving her words room to settle into the cracks of their uncertainty. She saw it, thin flickers of movement, subtle but real. A few heads nodded, tentative but present. It wasn't everyone, but it didn't need to be. Change never started with a chorus, it started with the brave, the ones willing to step into the light when others stayed in the shadows. As the group began to drift apart, Evans approached, his usual stern expression softened by a rare lightness. He was older than most here, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes carrying the weariness of years spent navigating this broken system. But tonight, there was something else in him, pride, maybe, or relief. "That was a damn good speech," he said, a small grin tugging at his lips. "You might just pull this off." Maya returned the smile, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire. "I will pull this off," she corrected, her voice steady. "And you will too. We're in this together now." He let out a soft chuckle, the sound warm and genuine, and for a moment, she saw the weight lift from him. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I think you're right." Reed's exit sent shockwaves through the precinct, but as the days stretched into weeks, it became clear that his absence was a gift, not a wound. Officers who'd once ducked their heads and kept their mouths shut began to speak up, their voices tentative at first, then bolder. Conversations that had been stifled for years bubbled to the surface about the way things had been, about the way they could be. Policies that had gathered dust were hauled out and torn apart. Training sessions revamped with a ferocity that surprised even Maya. Complaints long buried under Reed's reign were dug up, examined, addressed. It wasn't smooth sailing. There were arguments, resistance, days when the pushback felt like a wall she couldn't climb. More than once, she sat alone in her office, the clock ticking past midnight, wondering if she'd bitten off more than she could chew. But each time, she dragged herself back to the reason she'd started this fight, not for glory, not for revenge, but because justice wasn't just a word, it was a promise. As for Reed, he faded into obscurity, a ghost of the man he'd been. The last she heard, he was tangled in a web of charges: corruption, abuse of power, a laundry list of sins finally catching up to him. His name, once a thunderclap, was now a whisper, his influence shattered beyond repair. Maya didn't revel in his ruin. She didn't need to. His fate wasn't a trophy to hang on her wall, it was a consequence, cold and inevitable, born the moment he'd chosen to wield fear instead of integrity. Justice didn't dance in the wreckage of a man's life. It stood tall in the space he left behind, demanding something better. That night, as she locked her office door and stepped into the crisp evening air, a rare sensation bloomed in her chest. It wasn't just for her, though she felt it deep in her bones. It was for the people she'd sworn to serve, for the officers who were finally waking up, and for a department that was beginning to mirror the values it had long preached but rarely lived. Change wasn't a lightning strike, she realized. It was a slow burn, a string of tiny wins, hard-fought and fragile, stacking up toward something real. This was just the start. And she knew it. Reed's downfall was a lesson carved in stone. Power, when twisted and abused, didn't just crumble like dragged its wielder into the abyss. But Maya's rise was a different story, one of grit and defiance, a reminder that courage could tip the scales. She hadn't just fought for justice, she redefined it, proving that it wasn't about punishment alone, but about building something stronger in its wake. And as the stars blinked to life above her, she carried that truth forward, ready for whatever came next.